Please open mind. Discern this in all information. February 13, 2017. US and China are both busy with internal power struggles, so the world will have to wait. Posted on benjaminfulford.net. By Benjamin Fulford. There are intense power struggles taking place in the United States and China these days, meaning that big new initiatives for the planet as a whole will have to wait until the dust settles in both countries, Chinese and American sources say. The struggle in the United States is, to simplify things somewhat, between the deep state faction behind Trump and the remnants of the Bush/Clinton deep state apparatus. In China, three main factions are duking it out as part of an elaborate power dance that will produce a new central government lineup sometime around the end of March. When these power struggles are over, then we can expect major reforms of the Federal Reserve Board, the United Nations, the IMF, the EU etc. to begin in earnest. Let us start with the US power struggle, which has intensified now that Jeff Sessions has been formally appointed Attorney General. Immediately following his appointment, Trump issued an executive order that refocuses the federal government's energy and resources on dismantling transnational criminal organizations, such as drug cartels. As a Pentagon official described it, Trump declared war on the Bushes and Mexican drug cartels. Furthermore, in a sign, the anti-drug cowboys in the military and U.S. agencies are finally getting the message that force alone will not stop illegal drug use. Pentagon officials are saying Trump may decide legalize and regulate narcotics. This would help bring the roughly $2 trillion annual illegal drug business into the tax-paying mainstream and reduce drug-related death. If done properly, the massive pharmaceutical industry could be brought on board as long as they were given a role. That should be easy to do, since already around 30% of drugs prescribed by doctors are opium-based. The drug companies could add a whole new menu of goodies doctors could offer patients if they could start making medicines based on the other major narcotics. Doing this would also devastate the U.S. private prison slave industry by releasing half of the 9.5 million Americans who are either in jail or on parole. It would also radically lower crime rates. Ask the Swiss, who experienced an 80% drop in crimes committed by junkies immediately after they started letting doctors administer heroin to addicts. Most of the junkies were also able to eventually kick their addictions. Since 90% of the world's heroin is produced in Afghanistan, legalization and regulation of its opium crop would most likely lead to peace in that country. The Trump administration is also talking about stopping CIA drug shipments that go via U.S. military bases. In Japan, for example, the Yokota Air Base has long been a central distribution hub for North Korean amphetamines, according to senior Japanese gangsters. Shutting that trade down or else legalizing it would help clean up the Japanese political system big time. The same is true with the heroin trade going via other big U.S. Air Force bases such as Incirlik in Turkey and Ramstein in Germany. With so much money and power at stake though, you can be sure though that the Bush faction is not going down without a fight. The entire ISIS/Mossad/Bush CIA/Nazi, Hazarian Mafia Nazi faction, nexus is on the warpath, and the fact that prominent ISIS-linked criminals like Senator John McCain have not been arrested yet shows the power struggle is not nearly over. The Hazarian Nazis have been blackmailing the Pentagon White Hats with threats of nuclear terror, sabotage, scalar weapons etc. It is a good bet the ongoing disaster at the Oroville Dam in Northern California was an act of sabotage by the Nazi faction aimed at sending a message to the Trump regime. There is also large-scale cyber warfare going on. For example, Donald Trump's Twitter page was replaced on my computer with a page filled heavy-duty attack messages against Trump. The federal judiciary is also heavily loaded with anti-Trump people. Here is what the Pentagon source had to say about that. After liberal activist judges ignored the law and usurped power to block Trump's Muslim ban to stop ISIS infiltration, the federal judiciary may be purged all the way to the Supreme Court. That is not going to be an easy thing to pull off. The hardest power struggle of all, though, will be over control of the Federal Reserve Board. On that front, the announced resignation last week of two top Fed officials, Board of Governors member Daniel Tarullo and top Fed lawyer Scott Alvarez, means that, when combined with existing vacancies Trump will be filling, the Trump regime can now take effective control of the Fed. The last president to pull off a feat like that and not get assassinated was Andrew Jackson, but Trump has the backing of the U.S. military, so he might just pull it off. Since the globally traded U.S. dollars have been shifted now towards a system centered on China, it increases the chances that the U.S. will be issuing Treasury dollars separate from international dollars, possibly within a few months. This will also, as mentioned at the top of the article, mean a total revamp of the international financial and political architecture. However, this will have to wait until the power struggles in the US and China are completed. In a sign that Trump is willing to listen to delegate power and listen to good advice, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has made some good moves. For one thing, Trump has been convinced to go back to the One China policy and stop provoking China. Tillerson is also busy ridding the State Department of neocons as well as Israeli and Muslim agents. As a result, nasty thugs like Richard Armitage, Victoria Nuland, and Elliott Abrams have lost their power to wreak havoc in different parts of the world. The Japanese government has been thrown into considerable turmoil by the loss of power of their traditional bosses like Rothschild agent Michael Greenberg and Bush agent Richard Armitage. That is why they sent Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and a big delegation on a major brown-nosing visit to the Trump regime last week. Abe looted the Japanese National Pension Fund to buy favor with Trump, much to the consternation of many in Japan. This is how Abe was able to promise to finance the construction of a fast train service linking Washington, D.C. and New York. Overall, though, the Japanese establishment was reassured to find out that Japan/US relations during the Trump regime will be left to the professional bureaucrats and experts. The biggest change is that the Japanese were told the US had discontinued its policy of preventing Japan from having close relations with Russia. The Japanese were also told there would be less US interference in domestic Japanese politics, such as the murdering of disobedient prime ministers, from now on. That is because the US wants to keep Japan on its side as it negotiates world changes with China. Which brings us to the power struggle in China. The Chinese government is preparing for a once in 5 years power change that will mean 5 of the 7 standing members of the Politburo will be stepping down. The battle is over who will replace them and who will be crowned as successor to President Xi Jinping. Chinese government sources say the process is a complicated and time-consuming one that involves lots of consultations with very old retired top former officials. There are 3 main factions involved in this conflict. One is the faction behind Xi Jinping, which one might call the Northern faction. The other is the China Youth League faction that put former President Hu Jintao into the top office. This group is strongest in the south of China, the area around Guangdong and Hong Kong. Then there is the Shanghai faction that also has deep roots in Taiwan and is headed by Jiang Zemin. In the last power struggle, the Shanghai faction sided with Xi Jinping's faction to unseat Hu Jintao. The result was that Hu's choice of successor, Li Keqiang, ended up with the number 2 spot. However, Xi Jinping, once he assumed power, used a massive anti-corruption campaign as an excuse to decimate the ranks of both Hu's and Jiang's factions. That is why, if you were a betting type of person, you might bet that Hu and Jiang's factions might decide to team up against Xi this time around. However, the consensus so far is that China's elders will emphasize continuity and stability of government, so Xi will remain in power for another 5-year term and Li will also stay on as number 2. Nonetheless, it is still all bets off over who will be the designated successor and who will fill the vacant Politburo seats. In any case, China will be largely looking inward until this transition is over. That is why the next big moves on a global level will probably be seen in March and not during this month. On a final note, we are hearing that, behind the scenes, the Chinese and Americans are cooperating in the fight against the Nazi faction of the Hazarian Mafia. Thanks for listening and watching. Subscribe and share.